Live NFL trivia every Tuesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge and have a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. Norm Snead was a pretty good quarterback in the NFL for a pretty long period of time. He spent 16 seasons in the NFL, and he made it to 4 Pro Bowls with 3 different teams. As a member of the New York Giants in 1972, he even led the league in completion percentage. Snead threw for over 30,000 yards in his career. By the time he retired in 1977, he was one of just 7 quarterbacks in NFL history to accomplish this feat. While not a Hall of Famer by any means, Snead was a solid quarterback who absolutely deserves his place in NFL history. But not everyone thought that Snead was good, and perhaps his most vocal critic was his own teammate. In 1967, for some inexplicable reason that even with context I still cannot wrap my head around, Eagles wide receiver Gary Ballman decided to rip into his quarterback, despite the fact that Snead was one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL that year. And this is the story behind Norm Snead, Gary Ballman, and the absolutely bizarre drama and controversy of the 1967 Philadelphia Eagles. Before I talk about the actual controversy itself, we need some context as to just who Gary Ballman is. And our story begins with the other team that played in the state of Pennsylvania. As for this, we have to go to Pittsburgh. In 1962, the Steelers drafted Michigan State wide receiver Gary Ballman in the 8th round of the NFL draft. Even though the Denver Broncos in the AFL drafted him, and even though Ballman knew he wasn't going to play right away if he went to the NFL, Ballman decided to play in Pittsburgh anyway. And while the 1962 season was uneventful, as he did not have a single catch, he started to get some more playing time toward the end of the 1963 season. Over the final 5 games of that season, Ballman had 3 games where he went for over 100 yards receiving. With that strong performance at the end of the year, Ballman was inserted into the starting lineup in 1964, where he became one of the best receivers in all of football. In 1964, Ballman made the Pro Bowl after posting 47 receptions for 935 yards and 7 touchdowns, with the 935 receiving yards ranking 4th in the entire NFL and the 19.9 yards per catch ranking 2nd. For some perspective on just how dominant Ballman was that year, the Steelers threw 14 touchdown passes, and Ballman caught 7 of them. He led the team with 935 receiving yards when the next closest player had 334, and led the team with 47 receptions when the next closest player on the team had 17. Ballman was not just one of the best receivers in football, but considering the quality of his teammates and the production that the Steelers were getting elsewhere, you could definitely make the argument that he was the most valuable receiver in the game. Ballman followed that up with another strong campaign in 1965, where once again he led the team with 40 receptions, 859 yards, and 5 touchdowns. Pittsburgh only threw 10 touchdowns that season, and Ballman caught half of them. For his efforts, where he finished inside the top 10 in receiving yards, at 30 yards per catch with a career-high 21.5, he made the 2nd straight Pro Bowl of his career. But after another solid year in 1966, where he had 41 receptions for 663 yards and 5 touchdowns, his time with the Steelers was coming to an end. Because the following year, the Philadelphia Eagles made a push to acquire his services in a trade. In 1966, Philadelphia ranked 14th out of 15 teams in the league in receiving yards. Their top player in all 3 categories was Pete Retzlaff, who retired after the 1966 season ended. Throughout the entire year, the receivers on the Eagles combined for 1 touchdown, which came courtesy of Ron Goodwin in a game against the Steelers. When your receivers are scoring 1 touchdown across an entire season, that's not good. In fact, it's so bad that if you were the receivers coach that year, you were in serious danger of having to coach the Houston Texans. If Philly was going to be good, they knew that they had to seriously bolster up their passing game. With that, Philly made 2 big moves in the offseason to give quarterback Norm Snead some weapons to throw to. The first was acquiring Mike Ditka from the Chicago Bears. The second was a trade with the Steelers to get Gary Ballman. The Eagles gave up a fair bit to get it. They gave up fullback Earl Groves, who had scored 14 touchdowns over the previous 2 years. They gave up guard Bruce Van Dyke, who went on to become a Pro Bowl right guard with the Steelers. And they gave up a 3rd-round pick in the process as well. But the man they were acquiring was one of the most consistent receivers in football throughout the mid-1960s. They now had Ditka. They now had Ballman. And coming off a 9-5 season, the expectations for this team were now sky high, to the point where head coach Joe Kuharich was calling this Eagles team the best one he'd seen since he had been there. It was a bold claim, but at first it seemed like it was actually paying off. Through 4 weeks, the Eagles were 3-1, and Ballman was balling out. On opening day against Washington in a 35-24 victory, he scored 2 touchdowns in the first quarter. He followed it up in Week 4 with another 2-touchdown game. Ballman missed the Week 2 battle against the Baltimore Colts, so this meant that through his first 3 games, Ballman had 4 touchdowns and 237 yards from scrimmage. That is a really good 3-game stretch by any standard, let alone 1967. But in Week 5, the Eagles met the 49ers in an absolutely critical contest for both sides. Despite both teams being 3-1, neither team actually led their division, and this was at a time where there were no wild cards, meaning that you had to win your division to make the postseason. And even though this was a close game, Philly wound up losing it 28-27. To their credit, the Eagles were able to erase a 21-10 deficit in the second half and take the lead. But Ken Willard scored the game-winning touchdown in the fourth quarter for San Francisco from 4 yards out, and a field goal attempt by Sam Baker from over 50 yards out with just a few minutes left fell short. Ballman didn't have a great game on the stat sheet, with just 2 receptions for 32 yards, both of which were season lows for him at the time. And after the game, to say that Ballman lashed out against his quarterback would be an understatement. Before I go any further and talk about what Ballman actually said, I have to note something. Norm Snead was one of the best quarterbacks in football at this point in 1967. In fact, at that very moment, he might have been the best quarterback in all of football. In the 4 games that Snead played in that Ballman was a part of, Snead threw 11 touchdowns and 0 interceptions. Over those 4 games, Snead's passer rating was 130. I don't think I need to tell you how absurdly good that is, especially for 1967. And in the game that the Eagles just lost to the 49ers, Snead threw for 247 yards, 3 touchdowns, and no interceptions while posting a passer rating of 111.4. You would be hard-pressed to find any quarterback in football who was better than Snead at this particular moment. With that context, it makes what's about to happen make even less sense. Gary Ballman attended a banquet at the Norfolk Sports Club down in Virginia, and at this banquet, Ballman decided that it would be a good opportunity to completely bash the guy throwing him the football. He said that his quarterback was in a rut. He said that he had a favorite receiver to throw to, and that it wasn't him, and Ballman felt slighted by this, saying that he wasn't getting his share. It should be noted that Ballman had 11 receptions through the first 5 weeks, while the man lining up opposite him, Ben Hawkins, had 21, and he would eventually finish the season as the league leader in receiving yards. Alright, so Ballman feels upset that he's not getting the ball. Big deal, right? Every receiver who's ever played the game feels like this at some point, so this should be a non-story. Except for the fact that Ballman continued to talk and made matters way worse, because then he said Snead can't read defenses. He doesn't seem to be looking for his secondary receivers. If his primary receiver is covered, he doesn't throw. And finally, he blamed Snead for the loss against the Niners, calling his play calls terrible, and calling him delusional for thinking that he could pull off the game out with a touchdown pass at the very end. Again, this was the quarterback who was the top dog in the NFL right now, and here was Ballman bashing him, saying that he couldn't read a defense, couldn't call a game right, and couldn't throw him the football. Other than that, he had no complaints. Naturally, the Eagles were not happy about these comments at all. Norm Snead was not happy about these comments at all. And once the word got out that Ballman took this time at the banquet to just rip on his quarterback, he decided to stop the backlash in just about the worst way possible. Think of all the routes he could have gone with. The "it was the heat of the moment after a tough loss" excuse could be good. The "I was completely taken out of context" excuse could work. Instead, he went with one of the worst excuses of all time. Because you see, guys, he was just kidding. Ballman said on the whole thing, "I was just trying to create a little humor at the banquet. I always like to use humor at a banquet to entertain people. I would never blame any individual for a loss." Do I buy that for a second? Absolutely positively not. Number one, where was the punchline? Ballman is a natural comedian with incredible one-liners such as, if his primary receiver is covered, he does not throw. And we were only 1 point down and could have won the game by kicking a field goal. Ballman should have just quit his job as a player and become a stand-up comedian, because I'm in stitches just reading some of these amazing jokes. Number two, this was clearly not a one-time thing. In 1968, Ballman was suspended for a day by the Eagles for publicly criticizing Snead for not throwing the ball deep to him, and for an unimaginative offense. In 1971, after the Eagles fired head coach Jerry Williams following an awful 0-3 start, Ballman publicly criticized the front office for the move. Ballman was a receiver that wasn't afraid to speak his mind, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But why on earth are you trying to disguise it as a joke? You clearly meant it. It wouldn't be the last time you made comments like that. Just own it, apologize, and move on. Instead, the whole situation was a disaster. And it would only get worse from there. Because after those comments, the Eagles completely collapsed, as did Norm Snead and Gary Ballman. The following week, the Eagles got battered 48-14 at the hands of the St. Louis Cardinals, and Ballman only had 1 catch for 13 yards. Following a 3-1 start that year, the Eagles only won 3 of their final 10 games, finishing the season at 6-7-1. And while Ballman would play with the Eagles until 1972, he would never reach the successes that he had when he was with the Pittsburgh Steelers, scoring just 12 more touchdowns with the Eagles after making those comments. So what do we learn from all this? Bashing your quarterback at a banquet when he's the best in football and playing at an extremely high level, and he's the one that throws you the football, is not a good idea. However, if you're gonna do it, at least own it, and don't make one of the worst attempts at a backpedal I've ever seen. Because not only did nobody buy it, and not only did it just make Ballman really look stupid, but it may have been the catalyst for the Eagles, after a pretty hot start, completely falling off of a cliff. Be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, so it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Monday and Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JRGator9 and subscribe to 60-Second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.